Hello everyone, and a really warm welcome to this session, What's on the Horizon for Ovarian Cancer Diagnosis and Treatment. I'm Lizzie Hussain, I'm Deputy Director of Services at Target Ovarian Cancer, and I'm delighted to invite our panellists, Professor Usha Menon and Professor Charlie Gawley, to share their perspectives with us today. Anything that comes out of this session isn't medical advice, and it isn't a substitute for the information or advice that you've been given by your own clinical team. And so without further ado, let's get started.
Good morning, everyone. It's a huge pleasure to be able to share with you some reflections on UKC talks. I'd like to share some thoughts on what might be next for research into ovarian cancer. Thank you, Anwin and Helen, for this opportunity. As many of you know, with regards to ovarian cancer screening, at the moment, population screening is not recommended. And this is because there's been no reduction in ovarian cancer deaths in the screen arms of the trials that have taken place compared to the control arm. This was both in the US trial, the older US trial, the PLCO, as well as in our more recent, larger UKC talks trial. In UKC talks, we had a control group of 100,000 women, and we had two strategies we tested. One was an ultrasound strategy based on a vaginal scan, and the other was a multimodal strategy, which seemed to perform better. In the multimodal strategy, women had a blood test for CA125. That's something all of you are very familiar with. And based on the CA125 level and change over time in that individual, we had a algorithm, a Bayesian statistical algorithm, ROCA, that triaged women into low, intermediate, and elevated risk. About 50,000 women underwent screening, and over 345,000 screens were undertaken in this group. So on the average, a woman attended for 8 years of annual screening in the multimodal group. As I mentioned earlier, we did not save lives. There was no difference in deaths between the multimodal screen arm and the control arm. But the trial does provide a lot of data, and the multimodal arm especially provides information that can help us set the bar for future trials. We were able to detect 87% of the ovarian cancers diagnosed within 1 year of the test. And about 10% of women were diagnosed in earlier stage 1 and 2. So there was a 10% increase in stage 1 and 2 and an equivalent decrease in stage 3 and 4. When we look at women who did not have ovarian cancer, the algorithm correctly identified 99.8%. Now, this might seem like a really big number, and you might get the impression this is really good, but it does mean that 2 women had unnecessary surgery for every ovarian cancer we detected. Another way of looking at it is that for every 10,000 annual screens we undertook, 14 women had surgery and were found not to have ovarian cancer. They had benign masses or normal ovaries. And in these women who had unnecessary surgery, there was a major complication rate of about 3%. So the screening is not without harm. What these figures help us do is set a bar which new biomarker strategies must improve on. And just some other insights from UKC talks. It was clear that using a change over time in a woman of the CA125 levels was better at detecting cancer than if you had used a cutoff like 30 or 35. In a proportion of women with ovarian cancer, though the risk algorithm suggested that the woman had an increased risk of having ovarian cancer, the scans, both pelvic ultrasound and sometimes CT and MRI, did not pick up the disease because it was very early, very small in volume. I do want to make a note here that we did the screening between 2001 and 2011. It is now 10 years since then. And so there has been much improvement in the resolution of both pelvic ultrasound and in CT MRI scanning. Finally, while we picked up more women with stage 1 and 2 disease, we also picked up more women with low volume surgically detectable stage 3B disease compared to no screening. What is in the pipeline now is that there are a number of exciting markers. There's microRNA, exosomes, glycolipids, and even DNA and RNA of microbes that are being investigated as ovarian cancer biomarkers. And then there is circulating free tumor DNA, both in blood and in uterine samples. You would have heard of circulating free tumor DNA. It is very much the flavor of the month or the year. And these biomarkers, the tumor DNA, is part of the multi-cancer early detection tests, which are now being investigated. These are pan-cancer early detection tests. There are about 6 of them in the pipeline at the moment. And the aim is to detect multiple cancers, and ovarian cancer is one of them. And if successful, of course, that would be very exciting. So what are the priorities for ovarian cancer screening? Going forwards, increasingly eligibility will need to be based on personalized risk. So far, we have used genetic tests and family history, as well as age, to assign risk. Increasingly, the risk algorithms, and CAN-RISK is one of them, developed by the Cambridge group, are beginning to incorporate other risk factors, for example, height, weight, number of children, age when the first child was born, and alcohol consumption. And increasingly, I'm sure more risk factors will be incorporated so that risk can be more individualized. Women who are very high risk will, of course, continue to be offered surgery to remove their tubes and ovaries. And those at moderate risk, I hope there will be screening available for them. This will be the largest group of women. So what is required immediately, I would say, is new bioresources where we can evaluate these exciting biomarkers that are in the pipeline. We do have large biobanks from UK Talks and the American PLCO trial, but the way we collected the samples and processed and stored the samples are not in keeping with what is required for the new markers, especially for tumor DNA. So what we need is new cohorts where we can collect new samples. And one of the best and easy ways to effectively assemble such a cohort would be to ask women at moderate and high risk who are undergoing risk-reducing surgery to donate a sample prior to the operation. A cohort of about 2,000 women would lead to about 100, would mean that about 100 women had mainly high-grade serous occult cancers that would be detected at surgery. And the samples from these women could then be used to evaluate the new biomarkers to see if they are able to pick up cancers which are not picked up by CA125 or a vaginal scan. The we would need to move from the traditional screening trial, which is usually one arm versus control. And in the case of UKC talks, we compare two strategies versus control, to a multi-arm screening trial. So we have one group of women who are not screened, and then we have multiple strategies being compared at the same time to the group that has no screening. This is being done increasingly in treatment trials. We would also need to be more, think about it more carefully and go for a multi-stage process, where in stage 1, we would test for a clinical utility outcome. I showed you, what was the detection rate with multimodal screening in UKC talks? What was the reduction in advanced stage? What were complication rates and unnecessary surgery? We could put some cutoffs for all of these, and biomarker strategies after about 2-3 years of screening would need to have crossed these hurdles before we continue to stage 2, where screening would continue and the endpoint would be reduction in deaths due to ovarian cancer and cost effectiveness. So in summary, the future holds more personalized risk calculation for entry into screening trials, and a phased approach with an immediate need to set up cohorts where we can test some of the new biomarkers independently and assess their fitness for inclusion in screening trials. And then multi-arm, multi-stage randomized control trials will increasingly be the norm. As I said, ovarian cancer is one of the key cancers of the multi-cancer early detection assays. And some of these trials are at the moment on. And so we will get results from them as well, although they are not assessing lives saved, more the proportion of women who are diagnosed earlier with the disease. And I just want to end on the note that we do need to consider the treatment of ovarian cancers as well that are screen detected. If we diagnose aggressive cancers earlier, then we need to be really careful that we treat them adequately. With that, I'd like to thank everybody who contributed to UKC Talks, especially the women who took part, the funders who supported us throughout the 20 years, the independent members of our oversight committees, including Anwin, who has sat through multiple meetings for the last 5 years, the research teams and host organizations, and of course, my senior colleagues, without whom none of this would have happened. Thank you.